So we are getting started. We have 123 people here today. We know we'll expect a few more as we get going the rest of the morning. I would like to welcome you. I'm Natalie Sayre, your MC again, to the second day of our virtual 2020 Maternal Mortality Summit. We're so glad that you are able to join us. We're so glad that we were able to host this virtually, and we look forward to the day where we can gather again in person and have another connection experience. A little tough to have hallway conversations on Zoom, but we can have them in the chat box. But remember, we are recording now, so don't put anything in the chat box that your grandmother wouldn't approve of. We hope you enjoyed day one of our summit. Thank you for the ADHS team for kicking us off with an update about two new programs focused on improving maternal health outcomes in Arizona. We are also very grateful for our keynote speaker, Nicole Gonzalez, and our three panelists, Michelle Lacey, Dr. Maria Manriquez, and Lachey Brown, for all of their insights about the barriers women and families in Arizona face before, during, and after pregnancy, and some innovative ways to overcome those challenges. Today, we are excited to continue the summit with a joint meeting of the Arizona Maternal Health and Arizona Tribal Maternal Health Task Force. As I said yesterday, the Arizona Maternal Health Task Force has been an important opportunity to glean insight from clinical, non-clinical providers in our state and to foster collaborative efforts with partners across the state to direct and grow our maternal health programs. To this end, we are incredibly excited to launch the Arizona Tribal Maternal Health Task Force as a way of further engaging Arizona's Indigenous populations and perspectives. As a part of today's joint task force meeting, the Intertribal Council of Arizona will be discussing an Indigenous framework approach as a tool for cultural resiliency. Then we will close out the day with some facilitated discussions to brainstorm ways that we can improve access to care, health, equity, for people giving birth in Arizona. So remember, tomorrow we also have, both tomorrow and Friday, two opportunities to participate in the session on breaking through bias in maternity care, a virtual implicit bias training, which was designed and will be facilitated by the March of Dimes and Quality Interactions. This is a unique and exciting opportunity for participants, as this implicit bias training is specifically designed for maternal healthcare providers. These live sessions will take place on Thursday and Friday. If you didn't sign up for either one and would like to participate in a self-paced module at a later date, please contact maternalhealth@azdhs.gov to ensure you can take advantage of this incredible opportunity. So I have a little housekeeping before we get started with our daily blessing and opening. Remember to place your first and last name in the chat box, and then later today, you will be receiving a link to the summit evaluation. On that evaluation is where you'll enter those 3 keywords that we gave you yesterday. Also, remember that if you have trouble accessing the link in the chat box, we will be sending a follow-up email as a secondary way to access. But I know a lot of people like to just, let me fill out the evaluation so I don't forget about it as soon as I'm here. So that will be an option in the chat box. We're using the chat box to gather questions for our speakers. And again, we'll do our best to get to all of the questions, but those that we don't get a chance to answer, we will find a way to get answers back to you. The session again is being recorded in the chat box, including the private chat box or the private chat. So just make sure your grandmother would approve. We have also provided closed captioning. As mentioned earlier, you can access closed captioning in the lower toolbar, and it says show subtitles. If that will enhance your experience, please access it. For the last portion of today's meeting, we are going to be breaking into virtual groups and go through a facilitated discussion on how to improve health equity and access to maternal care in Arizona. Don't worry about the logistics for that. We will move you automatically. We'll give you prompts and help, but we truly hope that you're ready to share your ideas and thoughts so that we can improve maternity care or maternal care in Arizona. Are you ready to start? So enough of housekeeping. It is my pleasure to introduce a very special guest. Felicia Cocozzin Ruiz is a curandera Indigenous food activist, a natural food chef whose work is deeply rooted in the healing properties of all earth medicines, creating remedies from her tiny adobe kitchen friends lovingly called Felicia the kitchen curandera. Hence her business name was born. It is with great honor that, with the permission from her elders and earning the title of curandera in ceremony, Felicia carries on the lineage of natural healing ways through private consultations, medicine workshops, and ceremony. Felicia is going to provide us with an opening blessing and recognition for our meeting today. Please welcome Felicia.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good. So my name's Felicia, and I'm really honored to be here today because maternal health is a big part of my platform, working with Indigenous women, Black and Brown community here in Phoenix. I am Tewa and Chicana, and a big part of my practice is helping people about to give birth work mostly with traditional foods. So I'm really just honored to be here today. As we move into this new virtual world, I wanted to offer a blessing to Open Circle today. And it felt really disconnected for me to simply sit in front of my screen. And so I asked if I could make a video for you. And that's what I would like to offer for you today for your opening of your circle. All I ask is that when you watch it, that you really use your mind's eye to imagine the smoke blessing our bodies, because I can't be there and we can't be around each other right now. So when I say on the video to just close your eyes, really imagine that smoke, going over your head for good thoughts today, going over your eyes for clear vision today, going over your mouth so that we can all speak with clear words today, going over your heart for good emotions, and let it go down your legs so that we continue walking a straight path after this summit. And so that is all. Tlazokamati, thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Welcome. My name's Felicia Cocozzin, and I'm here in my yard today. I was invited to offer an opening prayer for today's circle, and I wanted to do so with a song to Tonantzin, which is the concept of sacred mother. I thought it was appropriate for today's gathering. So before we begin, I wanted to allow you the opportunity to smudge yourself, virtually smudge yourself with some sacred smoke. So go ahead and just close your eyes and imagine the smoke all around your body. And just take a deep breath before we begin. We Tonantzin, Tonantzin, we Tonantzin. We Tonantzin, Tonantzin, we Tonantzin. Ipane morani no yolo tatin, zazo kamati Tonantzin. Ipane morani no yolo tatin, zazo kamati Tonantzin. We Tonantzin, Tonantzin, we Tonantzin. We Tonantzin, Tonantzin, we Tonantzin. Ipane morani no yolo tatin, Nazo kamati to nanti, Nipame moani no yolotati. Nazo kamati to nanti. Omateo.
Thank you, Felicia. What a beautiful blessing. And thank you for sharing such a beautiful song as well. It's such an important way of grounding us in the work that we do and the content of the topics that we're going to discuss today. Next, I'd like to introduce Patricia Tarango, Heidi Christensen, and Lynn Lane from the Arizona Department of Health Services. They will provide a welcome and some opening statements today. Before I pass it to them, remember we are using the chat box today for all of your questions. So if you have questions, please place them in the chat box and we will do our best to answer all of them. Patricia?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Felicia, before I move forward, I just want to say thank you so much for your beautiful words and for your blessing this morning. I really enjoyed that. Good morning, everyone. My name is Patricia Tarango, and I'm the Bureau Chief for the Bureau of Women and Children's Health, and I function as the Director for the Title V Maternal Child Health Program here in Arizona. I want to welcome all of the members of the Maternal Health Task Force and our Tribal Task Force as well. Today's meeting is a joint meeting, and I'm thrilled to have all of you join us this morning. The focus of the day will center around exploring ways to identify and improve health equity and access to care in Arizona for women before, during, and after pregnancy. In July of 2019, the Governor's Goal Council identified maternal mortality as a breakthrough project. Through the input of our Maternal Health Task Force members, Arizona developed a 5-year action plan. This action plan became our framework for 2 distinct and successful grant applications. One is the CDC Maternal Mortality Review Committee grant, and the other is the Maternal Health Innovation Grant. Arizona is one of 9 states in the nation to have received the Maternal Health Innovation Grant, and I'm very proud to share that with you and to provide leadership for that grant implementation. These grants support several initiatives that include the availability of resources to local partners, ongoing assessment and monitoring of work, and monthly updates to the Governor's office to ensure successful implementation, evaluation, and impact. I want to thank the Planning Committee for today's agenda, the speakers, and look forward to our group discussion. I will now turn it over to Heidi Christensen. Heidi?
Next slide. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Maternal Health Task Force. The task force is an important part of the maternal health work here at ADHS, and since October of 2018, the task force has been collaborating to reduce maternal mortality and morbidities. As Patricia mentioned, the work we're doing now is a direct result of the task force efforts and collaborations. For some of you, this is your first opportunity to join us in our work to improve maternal health. And if you'd like to continue to partner with us, please reach out to our team at maternalhealth@azdhs.gov. Next slide. And I'd like to introduce you to our maternal health program staff. There's myself, Heidi Christensen. Kate Lewandowski is our MCH epidemiologist, and she works on both of our programs, the Maternal Mortality Review and the State Maternal Health Innovation Program. And Clark Bear is our Maternal Mortality Review Program Manager. Rhea Skoustra is our Public Health Nurse Consultant and Medical Record Abstractor. And finally, Lynn Lane, our Tribal Maternal Program Manager, who will be, I'm going to now turn the time over for a further introduction from her. Next slide.
Yaat bene. She dirt kia ani insle be between bushes chain, said a skisney da she, Kintlachini da shenella. Shema dosha Laverne, Dolira Lingua, ya. Totinis dize Ainasha. Good morning and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us on this virtual session of the Maternal Health Summit. We regret not meeting and not being able to meet in person. My name is Lynn and I am Dana. I was born and raised on the Navajo Nation. When I left home to go to college, my goal was always to return home to help my people. However, after almost 24 years, I have yet to return home. That's not to say that I didn't apply or got offered positions. It always came down to one obstacle, and that was where I was going to live. Housing is scarce on tribal lands. So if I couldn't go home to work, I did the next best thing and embraced an opportunity to work for another tribal community, where I was a part of a team who cultivated and nurtured a coalition. The Nutrition Coalition's primary focus was to revitalize Indigenous foodways, culture, and language to bring health and healing to the Atam and Pipash people. The work I did at Gila River was hard and very rewarding. However, I wanted something more challenging. I also had the constant reminders of my early goal of wanting to go home to help my people. So I reevaluated my life goals and thought, why not use my skills to advocate, support, and empower all tribes? So with this new plan, I left Gila River in March to work at ADHS as a Tribal Maternal Health Innovation Program Manager. I understand our tribal partners from the beginning of engagement efforts specifically requested the need for the tribal task force to address and work on their specific needs for programming and messaging. Therefore, one of my roles and responsibility in this position is to engage and recruit tribal communities to be stakeholders at the Tribal Maternal Health Task Force. We are also contracting with Navajo Nation Department of Health and Intertribal Council of Arizona to maximize resources to improve maternal health to Indigenous communities in Arizona. I understand that each tribe in Arizona is very different. They're very different from one another and have different approaches to implementing maternal health projects. I vow to honor and respect those processes and hope to improve maternal health in your community. But I need your help. We need people from your community to assist in implementing maternal health projects. Through this 5-year grant, ADHS will provide leadership, technical assistance, training, and resources to tribes in Arizona to implement a combination of effective, community-chosen, and culturally adaptive policy, system, and environmental improvements. We would appreciate your participation in this project as we understand your time is valuable. If you are interested in joining the task force, please contact us. Thank you for your time. Next slide. So to move on with the agenda, sorry, I'm having a little bit difficulties here. So to continue our agenda, I'm honored to introduce today's presenter, Eric Heidi. Eric will present on improving maternal health outcomes, Indigenous framework approach as a tool for cultural resilience. Eric Heidi is from the Dene Nation and is born for the Bitterwater Clan and for Weaver Clan. He is currently a health promotion specialist at the Intertribal Council of Arizona. He provides training and technical assistance to tribes in Arizona, Utah, and Nevada to implement cultural adapted chronic disease prevention projects. He holds a bachelor's in American Indian Studies from Arizona State University. Thank you for being with us, Eric.
Thank you for that welcome. I always kind of feel odd when people introduce me. But anyway, before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge where I'm at, where I'm presenting from. In this case, I'm presenting from O'odham and Peeposh lands here in Phoenix, Arizona. So before I usually begin any kind of conversation, I usually like to acknowledge the people and the lands that we are on. So for those folks in Arizona and Phoenix, be aware that you are on O'odham and Peeposh lands. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself. Dene nishne, Twitch ni nishne, Tuge bashis chin, Tachi ni dashe che, Toba and Chanela, Nakabitho e Yasina Shashe e Cardi nishye. For those that don't speak Navajo, my name is Eric Hardy. I am from the Navajo Nation. So I work for the Intertribal Council of Arizona as Health Promotion Specialist. And today I'm going to provide a presentation on cultural resilience and an approach of how we do that at ITCA with chronic disease prevention. And my hope is that you can kind of pull out some of the things around cultural resilience for the tribal communities that you work for. And it's important to kind of bring that conversation into the work that we do with tribal communities because cultural resilience is such a big thing for us as Indigenous peoples. And I also would like to acknowledge that normally I usually do this presentation with my coworker, Madison Fulton. Unfortunately, she's not able to make it today. And the reason why I'm bringing her into the conversation is because she's pivotal to this framework approach as well. So I want to acknowledge her before I begin. Next slide, please. So hopefully by the quick overview of today's conversation and presentation is I'll touch bases on what Intertribal Council of Arizona is, the grant that we are working on with the tribes in Arizona, Utah, and Nevada, and the conversation around how we engage with a conversation with colonialism and settler colonialism. And the reason we talk about these things is because it shapes our experiences as American Indians in the United States. And it brings the conversation up to us to be able to talk about historical trauma that relates to American Indians. And I'm saying this now to let you guys know that historical trauma isn't just a American Indian thing. It's actually a trauma response. A historical trauma response can actually happen for a number of other peoples. The language comes out from the Holocaust. So a lot of this conversation comes from that, and historical trauma is part of that conversation for us. And we hope to move a conversation into decolonization and how we couch cultural resilience in decolonization work and how we apply cultural resilience within their communities. Next slide, please. My hope is that you walk away from this presentation with an idea of how we apply the Indigenous framework approach in public health, have a good idea of what colonization, decolonization, historical trauma, and cultural resilience is for American Indians, and hopefully have some idea of how to work within building a relatable and practical cultural resilience framework with and for tribal community members. So, next slide, please. So this is Intertribal Council of Arizona. This is where I work. So go ahead and go to the next slide, please. The Intertribal Council of Arizona was established in 1952. We are located right across the street from the Heard Museum. So if you ever go to the Heard Museum, just literally across the street is where we usually are. Unfortunately, right now in the pandemic, we are all for working from home. So it's kind of like a ghost town over in ITCA right now. ITCA was established in 1952 as a response to termination. For those that are not familiar with American Indian history in the United States, there's an era in the 1950s and 60s where the United States as a policy approach to working with American Indians was to absorb tribal communities into the state, effectively terminating our tribal sovereignty and tribal status as American Indian nations. And this meant that all the services that are provided for American Indians, such as Indian health services, our own tribal government, all of those things would have been dissipated. So that's what termination was, and that's what we were looking at that night, around that time, 1950s and 1960s. During that time, as a response to that, approach from the United States, the first regional intertribal council came together. So a lot of tribes in Arizona came together to stop this termination, at least for Arizona. As a result, with the Intertribal Council of Arizona and among other tribes in the United States, we were able to, I want to say stop termination, but actually move past termination and get past it and start introducing other legislation in the United States that better serves American Indians. And as a result of termination, and because sovereignty was at stake, ITCA and its executive board takes action on matters that effectively affect collectively and individually all tribes in Arizona. We have a 21 member board. The only tribe that isn't represented on the board is the Navajo Nation. Reason being is that they're a big tribe. They get a lot of resources on their own. That doesn't mean that we don't work with Navajo Nation. We do work with them in different capacities. They just don't sit on the board. ITCA, again, back to sovereignty, protects, promotes, and strengthens tribal sovereignty with training and technical assistance throughout the state. Next slide, please. We work under the Health and Human Services team at ITCA. So we provide a number of services around teen pregnancy, chronic disease prevention, a few other areas with the Health and Human Services. We work under the Good Health and Wellness grant, and this is our team. On the far left, you guys might notice her. She's kind of famous in Arizona. She does a lot of work for our tribes. Her name's Alida Montilla. She's our Health and Human Service Director. Next to her is Glenda Tovar. She's our coordinator. We have Vanessa Dodge, who's an epidemiologist that works in evaluation. And we have Madison Fulton, who's my coworker that does the other part of the work that we do. And then there's me. So we have a 5-person team at ITCA that implements this grant. So next slide, please. So I'm going to touch bases on just what our grant is and the work that we do in public health. So go ahead, next slide. So this is a national grant from the CDC called the Good Health and Wellness in Indian Country Program. It's a 5-year grant from the CDC that allows us to work with chronic disease prevention with tribes in Arizona, Utah, and Nevada. The purpose of the grant is listed here. I won't go through everything. But one of the things that we do work on is increasing access to healthy foods in tribal communities. And that includes even promoting and increasing the practice of breastfeeding within tribal communities. So we've had to have a conversation about what does this look like in terms of breastfeeding for tribal communities and how do we frame that conversation. And I hope to kind of share that a little bit later. So chronic disease prevention utilizing 4 strategies, and ITCA primarily provides training and technical assistance to the tribes that we work for to implement projects that fall within the 4 strategies. So next slide, please. So these are the tribes that we work for in Arizona, Utah, and Nevada. We currently have around 12 tribes that we're hoping to work for, but we have about 8 right now. So we have a diverse number of tribes that we work for. And when I say diverse, it's not only just diverse in who they are, but they're also diverse in the way in which they do culture. And what does culture look like in those communities? But it's also diverse in how their programs and the way in which their tribal governments are developed and not developed. So it's pretty diverse. And I'm bringing that up now so I can get to a different part of the conversation a little bit later. So keep that in mind, is that we have different tribes that are in different places when it comes to culture. Next slide, please. In addition to that, we actually have a number of individuals that we work with that are actually non-native. So when it comes to culture and doing the work that we do in a culturally adapted kind of approach, culture kind of gets messy, especially if it's a non-native working in a tribal community. In addition to that, we also have folks that are native but aren't specifically from that community. Lynn kind of brought that up a little bit earlier. She's Navajo, but she works at Gila River. And I'm bringing this conversation up because it's something that we had to kind of approach in terms of how we do the work that we do when it comes to culture resilience. but it's a diverse program. We do a lot of different things, and these are a physical representation of the people that we work for and with. So next slide, please. So when we do cultural resilience, we wanted to kind of bring that conversation into the grant that we were working with. And a lot of times when we get grants from the CDC or from anywhere else, a lot of the times American Indians will look to ways in which we can culturally adapt that program to better fit the communities. In our case, we wanted to use cultural resilience as that framework to do that. So next slide. So how do we do that? Where do we begin? So for us, we just looked at the grant language and looked at where we can start to kind of have this conversation of cultural resilience in the grant. So this is the actual grant language in there, and it says purpose of the grant right on the top, and then on the bottom it says to implement evidence-informed and culturally adapted policy systems environmental changes. So for us at ITCA, again, this is ITCA looking at the grant. We were like, okay, well, we can ask the question of what do they mean by culturally adapted and what do they mean by good health and wellness? So for us, we used cultural resilience as a way to define those things. And how we did that is, I'll show you how we did that. But that's kind of how we had approached this grant, was how can we bring cultural resilience into public health work? So next slide, please. So we built a kind of a generic framework that we wanted to kind of use. And the framework kind of looks very generic again, because it is generic. We would see these kinds of frameworks for a lot of tribes that were working on different programs that were doing cultural resilience work. And most of them would fall into being accountable, being respectful, they're prioritizing their relationship to the communities, and there's just a sense of responsibility to the community. So we kind of wanted to, in some ways, define that a little bit more clearly. And when we did define that a little more clearly, we were also defining cultural resilience a little bit more clearly. And that's something that we really wanted to be certain that we did with our grant, but also with our subawardees, the tribes that we were working for. So how we did that, so next slide, please, is that myself and Madison relied on our educational background. And we both come from an American Indian Studies background, and we both have our degrees in that. And this is where we started to have this conversation about, if we're defining cultural resilience, how do we define that? And well, we're defining it from an American Indian Studies paradigm. And I highlighted a few things in this paradigm to kind of show you guys what that paradigm looks like. And if you want to look at the paradigm as a lens, right, like putting on a pair of glasses, when you put those glasses on, you'll see that the glasses are made of sovereignty, indigenousness, acknowledges desperate worldviews, different languages. It also acknowledges colonization and decolonization, and it privileges oral history and traditional knowledge. I'm not saying that you should have an American Indian Studies degree to do cultural resilience. It's a way for us to frame and to define cultural resilience using these concepts. So that's what we did. And it helped us define cultural resilience from I guess you could say in a more American Indian standpoint, with using this as a lens. Next slide, please. And we kind of did how should I put this, like a juxtaposition with public health paradigm. And I'm not trying to minimize public health paradigm. I'm not saying it's not any less or any better than AIS. But when it comes to working with American Indian communities, you can definitely see that there's things missing from when compared to the American Indian Studies paradigm. As much as public health is beneficial for a lot of folks, like it states like health is a complete physical, mental, social well-being, and really not absence of disease and infirmity. When you go through this paradigm, there's no mention of like sovereignty. There's no mention of colonialism, decolonization, or oral history. So in some ways, the scope of the paradigm, it's missing a few things when it comes to working for American Indians. but it also would define culture resilience in a very different way. So we kind of use these two lenses, right? So you have the AIS lens and the public health lens. And we went back to that paradigm, sorry, not the paradigm, the framework. So next slide, please. So when we went back to the slide with this framework with American Indian lens, different things would pop out of it. So this is us, ITCA, developing our framework from an AIS to incorporate culture resilience in the work that we do. And when we use the AIS lens to redefine our framework, accountability became about sovereignty and upholding sovereignty. So sovereignty could be like data sovereignty, could be health and welfare and all these other things. Being respectful meant that we're respectful of each of their tribes that we work for in terms of their cultural background and their worldviews. Prioritizing relationships, again, was about how do we engage the tribes on their level, which again goes back to sovereignty. And how can we help maintain sovereignty? So developing memorandums of agreements and things of that nature before we do any sort of work with the tribe. So that's prioritizing your relationship and acknowledging that the tribes have sovereignty and they are their own self-sufficient tribal communities, but also have cultural protocols that they need, that are in their communities that we need to follow. Being responsible with the community, which is right, informed consent and getting their input in all the work that we do. So this is what it looks like when we have an AIS background to define culture resilience using this framework. And this is us, ITCA, with our big academic hats on and all those conversations that we have with ourselves and with our schoolwork. So in a lot of ways, we've had time at, to discuss these things with school, right? So there's a definite disconnect between our academic background and the communities that we work for. So we found and we saw that discrepancy. And so we want to kind of find a way to do this, I guess, work in a better way or a more impactful way by having culture resilience more impactful to the community. So what I'm going to show you next is how we kind of did that using this concept of lenses. So next step, please. Slide, please. And we did that doing a comparative analysis. This is something that we did with our community members and our tribal subawardees, just to get them to think about how we're approaching this grant, not so much on an academic level, so to speak, or programmatic level, but more from their perspective, and to help guide that conversation a little bit. So next slide, please. So this comparative analysis, again, to touch on different things, is that it was to help us define culture resilience, right? And using the AIS framework as opposed to a public health framework. So we did this with our tribes to help them kind of see what we were trying to do with this grant and to get their input on how to do this. And we did this comparative analysis, right? So on one hand, they'll be looking at this framework and asking questions like, what does it mean? So we wanted to kind of help them define that. So next slide, please. So we started out with questions, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these questions, but I will pause a little bit. So go ahead and push. Yeah, there you go. So on your end, this is what we did with our tribes to kind of help them define the lenses around the grant that we're doing to define culture resilience in terms of them being healthier, quote unquote healthier. So quickly, just think about, what does health or being health mean to you? So I'll give you guys like 5 seconds to think about that. What does health or being healthy mean to you? So next button, I guess, slide. The next conversation piece is then, where do you get your ideas from and that information about being healthy or health, being good health from? So think about that for 5 seconds. So next slide, please. So one of the things that came out of this conversation we have with our tribes, and you guys will probably think about this too in terms of your own questions and your own answers, was that a lot of the time the answers were like, well, being healthy means we don't have diabetes, we don't have hypertension, there's no cancer, there's no, a lot of those kinds of answers came out. So next slide. In a lot of the ways it meant the elimination of illnesses and diseases, which is fine, and that's okay. Next, please. Next. And it falls within more of like a public health framework, right? And then that's fine. And when we ask, like, where do you get those definitions and those ideas from, right? Where those ideas of health from? Next slide. And then when they say the WHO, it's these folks, right? The doctors, the programs, the teachers, the schools, the nurses, all those folks that tell us, like, this is what healthy means, the experts, so to speak. Next slide, please. The next one. I had those in there just for some laughs. So now that we have this idea of like health from, say, a Western or maybe a public health framework kind of somewhat defined in our community's minds and also in yours, right? We asked the question of, well, how is health defined from a cultural perspective? And for folks in the Zoom space, this might be a little bit difficult to answer for you, but think about that a little bit. Like, how would you define health from a cultural perspective or an American Indian perspective? So think about that for like 5 seconds. Next slide. And then the next question is the same, right? Who and where do we get those teachings from, that knowledge from, of health from? So think about that for 5 seconds. Go ahead. Next slide, please. So when we did this with our tribes, they had kind of different answers from the first set of questions. A lot of the folks that we worked with, again, tribal communities, they were saying, well, we get our ideas of health from our indigenous knowledge. We get it from ceremony, from oral history, from our languages. But we also get it from specific people in our communities. And when we had asked that question, or kind of jumped into that question a little bit, what did they mean by specific people? They were saying, well, we have experts in our tribal communities that had certain knowledges about different things, and to kind of bring the conversation to women's health and maternal health, like folks like women knew how to do birthing practices, know how to do ceremonies for women when they were in being pregnant and giving birth. Men had puberty ceremonies, and these ceremonies and a lot of things were in some ways gendered, right? Certain ceremonies were men, some were for men, so for women. So a lot of that was what they were telling us, is that to be healthy meant that you would go to these ceremonies that were for men or for women, and different ways in which cultural protocols were attached to those certain things, to those certain quote unquote genders. In addition to that, like folks were also saying like healthy foods, traditional food knowledge, where do you get those foods from? And other folks were even talking about the way in which we talk about breastfeeding as an indigenous food, and how that's so much different now. And also talking about kinship, and how when raising a child or even giving birth, like family and community are together because it's such a big deal. And it's such a significant thing for our communities. So, and it's all based on culture. And a lot of folks said that it's the health of the land too. Next slide, please. So those that are not familiar, that's San Francisco Peaks, or Dokotzli in Navajo. And they all told us is that we all have a connection to land, and that's important to us as Indigenous people. And next slide, please. And when we asked them, like, where did you get all that information from? And they were like, well, we got it from our elders, our medicine people, which included men and women, right? Because different ceremonies for men and women. Ceremonies as well, oral history, cultural teachings, community, personal experience. Next slide, please. That's Winona No Nuke Leduc. I like her name, so I like saying it. So anyway, these are specific people, significant people in our communities that had this knowledge, and that's where we had our experts, right? We had different types of experts. So now that we've kind of gone through those two questions, right? You had a Western idea of what health and healthy being, and then you had more of a cultural perspective of that kind of in people's minds. So next slide, please. And think of that in terms of AIS and public health, right? Next slide. So we wanted to kind of shift that conversation a little bit. Again, we're having this conversation with our tribal communities, and we asked the question, like, currently, what does health look like in our tribal community? So think about that for a moment. So next slide, please. And then the next question that we asked our tribal community members is, do you think we live in a healthy way from our cultural teachings, and why or why not? So think about that for just a moment. Next slide, please. So when we did this, a lot of our participants, and maybe even you now can think about this a little bit, is that right now we don't live that way. We have a lot of health issues, health concerns in our communities, right? I don't spend a whole lot of time on that because we, as Indigenous people, as American Indians, we know that stuff. We know that we have issues, and I don't like to spend too much on that, but we rather would have the conversation of like, why are those issues there? And in this case, those issues are there because our tribal community members would say that our languages and our cultures, our way of life was disrupted, right? Cultural losses, we don't speak the language. We don't know what all this stuff, so we don't know what ceremonies are. So all of this would come up in these conversations. Like our kinship and our families were fractured, and this gets into that conversation of like, how did we live in a community that we were aware of all of our gender roles, all of our family roles from a traditional point of view? All of that was disrupted. So in a lot of ways, that family structure, that family life, or quote unquote healthy family life, defined from our culture perspective, was diminished. Our traditional lands were fractured and diminished too, right? We don't have access to certain areas anymore because there's a freeway going through it. So next slide, please. This is the last speaker of the Lumbee tribe. And that's something that they were saying, is that we're losing a lot of this. We're losing it. We're losing and these healthier cultural practices, and we're losing it, but it's also being taken away. I'll get to that conversation a little bit later. There's a distinction there. And when we ask the question of why do you think it's the way it is, go ahead, next slide. Folks would kind of, in a lot of ways, would vaguely say, well, culture was suppressed, and sometimes in some ways, as a result of all this stuff that we went through, sometimes culture wasn't or isn't seen as relevant anymore. It's seen as something that's in the past, or maybe it's not useful anymore. So all this kind of came out of this conversation. So next slide, please. And when they were telling us this, they were kind of talking about, next slide, what this is, without using the terms colonization and historical trauma as root causes. And that's where we kind of came into this conversation of using our AIS background to help guide our tribal community members to kind of frame why cultural resilience is important to their communities. So that's Tom Tortolino. If you don't know who he is, he's a Navajo dude, our guy. On the left side of that picture, he's coming into the boarding schools, right? And then the one on the right is where he's leaving the boarding school. It's such a stark picture, representation of what we went through with colonization. And that's just going through colonization. There's a whole other part of the trauma that is a result of that colonization. And that's what our community members were telling us. And I'm sure that you guys are thinking of that too, like where our communities and tribal communities are in unhealthy places, but there's a reason why it is that way. And we want to bring that into the work that we do, again, to frame why cultural resilience is important. We came in with these other ideas, colonialism and historical trauma, to get to why cultural resilience is important. Next slide, please. In order to get to that part of why cultural resilience is such an important thing, we do have to talk about the bad stuff, and we have to name that stuff. We have to name what that happened to us, what we're healing from, right? Because if cultural resilience is a means to heal, we also have to kind of understand what we're healing from. And this is where we bring in these concepts. So next slide, please. So what is colonization? I think a lot of folks have difficulty time kind of defining what that is. And in some ways, it can be a contentious term because it brings in a history that isn't the most happy. And that's fine. I think that's okay if people feel that way, but it needs to be talked about so we can talk about it, right? So colonialism in America is very specific. It's very specific to America, how colonization works here in the United States with American Indians. Colonialism will work differently in Australia, Canada, and Canada and New Zealand. So for here, again, how we're talking about historical trauma for American Indians, colonization of the United States shapes that narrative of historical trauma for us as American Indians. And then colonization is about land and getting land up first and foremost. And how do you get land from another group of people? And in order to take that place, in order for colonization to take place, next slide, please. Right? You have land, you got one on the right and one on the left. Next slide. It creates a relationship, and that relationship is, next slide. Next slide. Is based on this relationship, the colonizer and the colonized. And that's the relationship that is built on. Next slide. And this relationship can be violent to non-violent. And we've seen that historically, right? So next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So that relationship in a lot of ways historically was the Indian Wars, right? Then you had boarding schools, and then you had reservations. A lot of ways, that's what this relationship is built on. So colonization is a relationship between the colonizer and the colonized, and you can't have one without the other. And that's what we're trying to get in here. A process, right? It's a 500-year process that has created this relationship. In some ways, we're still in that relationship. And I'm bringing this conversation up because I'm not to kind of point fingers and say, oh, your fault, or creating this us versus them dialogue. It's more about understanding what is colonization and its relationship to us as peoples, and to be able to talk about it. It's to kind of have that understanding, so then when we can talk about it, we can do something about it. So next slide, please. So generally, colonization is talked about as in quote unquote the past, when early America settlers coming over to America. But there's also something called settler colonialism. So next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Sorry. Next slide again. So originally I said colonization was on this relationship, right? Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So that's normally what colonization is, right? They create the relationship is created. What settler colonial is that in order for colonization to take place, one people creates permanence through erasure. And that erasure can be violent to non-violent. And what this means is that when colonization initially happened, the idea was come over, get land, and then go back, quote unquote, home. And settler colonialism says that no, that's not how this works. Settlers came over and now they're here to stay. And that's what's happening currently with America. Every other country that's been colonized, it starts to kind of settle. You're settling that area. And that's when we talk about how does the colonization work to do this. As an example, for those that are in Phoenix, South Mountain is South Mountain. That's how we know it. But it's actually got an O'odham name, Mohodat, that's been in some ways erased because we renamed it South Mountain. So you can see how that works now, is that colonization comes, and now it's settled, and now it's erasing the indigenous presence in the area to get, again, back to land. So that's kind of what we deal with. Next slide, please. But to bring it back to the conversation of women's health and even men's health, is that colonization is gendered. It just doesn't happen monolithically to a people. It happens also differently to women and men. In the case of women, a lot of the history, when you look at it, is that women were painted and seen as part, like they are the carriers of the population. So they were targeted as a means to diminish that our population as American Indians. But in addition to that, women were also painted as impure, as how should I put this, as unhuman in a lot of ways. When you look at the history, you'll see some of that language of women and indigenous people generally as impure, right? But also women were impure. So when folks are impure, that means they're open to violence, and that's what viable means. They're violable, they're rapeable, so to speak. In addition to that, they were also hypersexualized. You'll see this with like Pocahontas, right? Pocahontas was a young 15-year-old girl, but she was taken. And this is where we start to see colonization and patriarchy working together. But this is kind of how it works. What that means is that colonization targeted women, but also targeted women and the knowledge that they held, the expertise that they held. So that meant the erasure of, like I said, women's ceremony, women's cultural protocols for birthing practices or breastfeeding, and their roles in families and their roles in their communities. So all of that starts to fall apart. And that's kind of where we're at now, right? Gender and family roles were erased through colonization. For men were emasculated. Men weren't allowed to fight back or protect. And if we were, then we were punished for it. So a lot of times when you read the literature, you'll see that American Indians, as a result of being emasculated and not being able to let out that rage, it turns inward into their own communities. And in addition to that, our roles and our family roles and our community roles were taken from us and left a void in who we are as men. So now we replace that with patriarchy. And that's kind of how this works for us as Indigenous men, is that we use patriarchy now to define who we are as Indigenous people, as Indigenous males. And again, because colonization came in and disrupted our gender, family, and community roles in our communities. So now we have men that are not a part of our communities, right? They're alcoholics and missing from families and whatnot. That's the general idea of what men are. So all of these things happen within colonization. So it is gendered. It impacts men and women differently. As an example, for women, you had forced sterilization in 1970s. Again, that's because women were seen as impure or not capable of raising children. Births happen in hospitals now, whereas before they were happening in the community and with ceremony. And Indigenous breastfeeding was part of that ceremony that was disrupted. And then currently you have missing and murdered Indigenous women. So it's a continual process. So I wanted to put that out there so we can talk about how it ties to maternal health. But also the next slide, please. All of this is historical trauma for us. It's the cumulative emotional, psychological wounding over a lifespan across generations emanating from mass group trauma experiences. Colonization frames that for us, all right? It's how this works, and it grounds all of that trauma that we've gone through for 500 plus years into today. Next slide, please. So I put it in here to kind of lighten the conversation a little bit because it can get pretty heavy about colonization. But the way you can think about trauma is like she's punching him in the face. That's the trauma, right? Getting punched. Next slide, please. So it's like for us as American Indians, we get punched in the face for 500 years. But there's also a other side to that conversation. It's how we respond to that trauma, right? It's a constellation of features perceived as related or as a reaction to historical trauma. So next slide, please. in this case, he's crying, which is a healthy response to getting punched in the face because it hurts. And as I said earlier, colonization in a lot of ways disrupted and erased a lot of our practices, cultural practices, to respond healthy to the traumas. You can look at I think it's I forget what act it is, but our religions and our cultural practices were actually outlawed in the 1930s, 40s, somewhere around that time. That disrupted a lot of all of our healthy practices, like going to ceremony and going to our cultural experts to kind of heal from all of this. A lot of those things were taken away from us and even outlawed. So if we practice it, those cultural practices, we would get thrown in jail or even prison. So that's what our historical trauma is, right? All the colonial impacts that happened, that's the trauma. And then our response now is not so much in healthy ways. So next slide, please. So I want you guys to think about this really quickly. So next slide, please. So what are some of those examples of historical trauma, right? What are those? So think about that just for a moment. Next slide, please. And what are some examples of historical trauma response for American Indians that you can think of? So think about that for a few seconds. Next slide, please. Next, please. So this is some of the historical trauma that we've experienced as American Indians. And again, just to kind of reframe and bring everyone back to why we do this, is we were doing this so folks have ways in which to talk about our experiences as American Indians so that we can talk and frame culture resilience much more from an American Indian perspective and why it's important. And also for others that are non-native to kind of see what we're getting at, like why is culture resilience such an important thing and how do we engage that conversation? So as a result, when we asked our community members about, well, what are some of the historical trauma pieces that you can think of? And it would range from everything. There's a lot of trauma, but we touch on a few things. Some of them are like straight up massacres. Some are being removed, right? Trail of Tears, Navajo got removed. Boarding schools are such an impact in our communities that not only did it assimilate, and when I say assimilate, it also eliminated cultural teachings, right? When you assimilate something, you're erasing something else. And in this case, it was disrupting and erasing our families. A lot of things that we don't talk about generally we don't talk about is boarding schools erased how families work, family structures work in our tribal community. So things like having a nurturing family to support breastfeeding and supporting for birthing practices, all of that was disrupted with boarding schools. So you had kids coming back from boarding schools into tribal communities that didn't have that cultural background anymore. They didn't understand how to fit into their families who were culturally based. So a lot of that got disrupted. So things like, why is breastfeeding important? That went out the window with boarding schools because when that came back, those teachings weren't there anymore. They didn't have those teachings. And those teachings were outlawed, right? With outlawing of cultural and ceremonial practices. And that's the code I was alluding to earlier, Religious Crimes Code of 1883. So from that point on to, I believe, the early 1970s, where we had the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, that time period between 1883 between 1972, 1978, our cultural practices and ceremonies were outlawed. So think about that. That's almost 100 years of disruption of our cultural practices, like ceremonies, ceremony and including birthing practices, right? Traditional birthing practices, cultural teachings around breastfeeding, cultural teachings around women's health and how to maintain. All of that was disrupted in addition to boarding school. So those are historical trauma. Then you had forced sterilization again, and you have current traumas. You had Standing Rock a few years ago. You have the Loop 202 demonstrations here in the Phoenix area. And one of the big things that we talk about is missing and buried Indigenous women. So all of these things are examples of historical trauma or even current trauma. Next slide, please. And because our healthy ways in which we engage those engage those trauma and from healthy cultural ways were disrupted, sometimes we fall into all those issues that we have in our communities, right? All the high rates of diabetes, alcoholism, suicide rate, all of those are responses to the historical trauma. It's something that, again, I don't like to spend a whole lot of time on. Again, I'm more talking about why do we have these issues in our communities. And for me, that's talking about colonialism's impacts and historical trauma and how we respond to historical trauma. Because currently we respond to them in a lot of unhealthy ways. And it's not necessarily our fault. We got to remember all of our healthy ways in a lot of ways were disrupted. So we're having to figure out how to do this better, this response to our traumas in different ways and healthier ways. Next slide, please. And when I say that, this is where cultural resilience comes into the conversation. This is how can we heal from those traumas and the impacts of colonialism in healthier ways. And next slide. And we do that by talking about decolonization. So as I said earlier, colonization is a relationship, right? So next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Decolonization breaks that relationship. It's like I said, colonization, one cannot exist without the other. Decolonization allows us to break that relationship. And when I said earlier about colonization and creating this us versus everyone else dialogue, that's not my purpose. My purpose is to get to here so that we understand how colonization impacts both American Indians and non-natives, so then we can break that relationship. Everyone has a role in this conversation about creating a different way in which we relate to each other. And it's not based on power, which is what colonization is in a lot of ways, and oppression. It's about understanding each other on a human level, understanding that our traumas are valid and that there are ways in which we can heal from those traumas in different ways. And for us as American Indians, we would like to do that healing through cultural resilience. So next slide, please. Next slide. So cultural resilience is the ability to overcome stress and regaining health and well-being after experiencing adversity. It emphasizes how people overcome adversity by drawing from the social and cultural networks and practices of the community. So for us, again, when we talked about early on in the grant, like how do we bring cultural resilience into the grant? We had to talk about all that bad stuff first to talk about why it's important and how can we frame that. And despite all the things that happened to us with colonialism and historical trauma, there are certain things that we still have in our communities. We still have language. We still have some ceremonies. We still have some folks that do cultural experts, like that do women birthings, that are doing Indigenous breastfeeding. So it's relying on and bringing those people into the conversation and cultural experts and specialists into the conversation about how do we heal in a public health sense or in a chronic disease prevention sense or a women's health sense, to rely on those things and rely on something called survivance, which is Native people's abilities to persist despite enormous adversity imposed by colonialism. So that's what we're telling our community members about, and you guys, is that when we talk about cultural resilience, this is why it's important, and this is how we frame it for American Indians. So next slide. Next slide. So what are examples of cultural resilience as a response to historical trauma? Just think about that for a few seconds. Next slide, please. So when we did this in some ways with some of our tribes, they gave us answers. Next slide, please. So those examples of cultural resilience, it could be small things, which is fine. And I'll get to why that's important a little bit later. Learning your indigenous language. Lynn introduced herself this morning. I introduced myself in my language this morning. I will say that I don't speak Navajo fluently. I speak pieces, but just the fact that I can speak my introduction in Navajo is a part of cultural resilience, and it's empowering. Makes me feel good. Participating in cultural activities, creating healthier relationships with your families, taking care of yourself, and learning even gender cultural practices and protocols. Those things are important. Engaging a conversation about how did our women have birthing practices in their community, or how did they talk about breastfeeding? I think those are all important conversations that we can have with our community about cultural resilience. Preparing healthy traditional indigenous foods, learning about cultural kinship values. And there's something in Native communities that we talk about as being a good relative, which is just taking care of each other and helping each other, and like a good relative would. Next slide, please. That's what that does. Again, earlier, like I said, when I speak my language, I feel empowered. I feel happy and healthy and accepted and all these things. But there's other things that come out of that conversation too. And when we go through understanding why historical trauma and colonization, all those things, and it gets you to think too. It gets you to critically think about why we are in the situations that we are as American Indians, and why those unhealthy outcomes are in our community. And in a lot of ways, it feels good to kind of know why, right? There's a lot of madness in our communities, in tribal communities, that sometimes it's difficult to kind of think outside of that madness. But I think when you name these things, right, our experience as impacts of colonialism, historical trauma response, and decolonization, it helps to kind of lessen the madness and that noise. So next slide, please. So now that we went through this conversation in two different and kind of a couple different ways. One, I showed you guys how we did that with our tribes, our sub-awardees, to kind of help them understand what we meant by cultural resilience using that framework, right? They can kind of we went kind of through a really quick AIS 101 class. And that's something that we wanted to do, so that it helps them shape their viewpoint of what cultural resilience is, but also helps them kind of name American Indian experiences with colonialism. And I hope that you guys saw that and could see that and feel that too. So now we did that, we can actually start to have a conversation about, okay, now we know all these things, where do we begin to heal? So next slide, please. So we come back to this with our sub-awardees and ask them, like, now do you see why sovereignty and culture and all these things matter? It looks a little bit different now. They can see why some of this is different now, as opposed to, or differently from like a public health or Western framework. They provide that, I guess you could say, more context and more understanding of why that's there, or why understanding our cultural histories and how that impacts us today is important. So next slide, please. So when it comes to our work, I'm kind of going to show you guys like what it means when we're working in a space like public health. So next slide. So what we did to help you guys kind of understand what we did on a much more, I guess, a broader level, is that we created a spectrum between what we normally are usually told to do, or what we're allowed to do in some ways, or what we're taught to do, which is the conventional framework, right? Talking about health from a very, and I'm not trying to minimize or diminish anything about this, like a Western approach, a Western framework. And then there's an indigenous framework, right? So we created a spectrum that we can have a conversation about how we do healing and how we do cultural resilience in the spectrum. So next slide, please. And all we do at ITCA, to kind of simplify it, is we just get our tribes to kind of move their chronic disease prevention activities closer to the indigenous side of things. And that's kind of what we did, right? It's basically creating that spectrum and supporting and providing spaces where the tribes, right? The tribes do that work to move closer to the indigenous side of things. And I'm Navajo, and I work with a lot of different tribes. So I allow them to define what that looks like, moving to the indigenous side of things. So next slide, please. And so what this means is that as an outsider, right, and we're all outsiders in some ways with the work that we do with tribal communities, is that when we think about colonization, historical trauma, and the history of all the communities that we work for, all the tribal communities that we work for, colonization, historical trauma, and how we respond to that trauma, it all looks different in all the different tribes. And what I mean by that is that cultural resilience will look different in each of those tribes. I'll say what that means is that, say, tribe 1 is a tribe that maybe lost most of their land, had really heavy losses in terms of their language and culture. And so when it comes to defining their project, maybe a chronic disease prevention project or even a maternal health project from a cultural standpoint, it's going to be closer to the more Western framework because that's just what happened. And so cultural resilience is going to look very different there. So in that space or that community, maybe cultural resilience means they have maybe some language in their work that they're doing, or maybe they have some idea what those cultural practices look like. And that's not a bad thing again, right? It's not their fault. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not their fault. You have to meet them where they're at, given their experience with colonization, historical trauma. But then maybe tribe 2 was not so much impacted. Maybe they have access to their traditional lands, maybe have more access to their ceremonies and to language. So cultural resilience there is going to look very different. And the way in which they talk about culture is going to be very different. And so you have to be aware of this with all tribes, right? There's over 560 tribes in the United States. We're all impacted by colonization and respond to all of this trauma in different ways. But the important part is that us as outsiders allow them to take the lead, and that's where the accountability and sovereignty come into the conversation, is to help support them in the work that they're doing to move closer to the indigenous side of things. And that's what we do at ITCA. And this is part of it, laying out the groundwork of how do we talk about colonization, historical trauma response, and cultural resilience to get back to this conversation of like, okay, all this happened. Where are you guys at in your tribal communities with cultural resilience? Is it important? Is it not? And help them kind of work towards doing more indigenous quote unquote work. Next slide, please. And this brings us to this conversation of like, where do we begin to heal, right? Because healing would look very different with tribe 1 as opposed to tribe 2. So that spectrum is important. Next slide, please. So the other part of this conversation is that we have to be aware that even though cultural resilience is important, we also have to be aware of where we're at now, like literally right now. American Indians, to kind of bring this into the conversation, is we didn't have diabetes in our communities traditionally. We didn't have high rates of suicide. We didn't have all these other new diseases and issues in our community. So we do need insulin shots. We do need therapy. We do need all these other things to kind of address these new concerns and issues in our communities. So we're not saying that you need to throw everything out that's Western. It's about finding that conversation where you're at and what you need with Western knowledge, and finding ways in which to incorporate indigenous and culture knowledge and culture resilience into that work too at the same time. So it's a messy balance, but it's important. So that's kind of what we're doing with the grant, and I hope that you guys are aware of this when you are working with tribal communities. Is culture resilience will look different, but we also need some Western practices and other things to kind of help us become healthier communities, because healthy now looks different than healthy back when our cultures historically. Next slide, please. So when we do our work with our public health grant now to move our tribes closer to the indigenous side of things, we do encourage things like indigenous gardening, right? For access to healthy foods, cultural teachings about food and physical health. So we encourage that. Traditional food gathering is some of the projects that we've worked with some of the tribes. And it wasn't just traditional food gathering. In some cases, we were able to ask those communities if they could include like traditional place names if they knew those place names. We've had some tribes do cookbooks. These cookbooks had a combination of traditional foods in terms of the foods that were grown within their communities, but also foods that came out of the colonial process, like fry bread and bannock and all these other foods that came out of that. So it was a mix. And we also have a conversation about breastfeeding practices and what does that mean in terms of women's gender roles, traditional gender roles, and their place and kinship in the community, and what does that look like in terms of being healthy in a cultural perspective. And how do we talk about healthy foods, breastfeeding as a healthy food in tribal community? So these are some of the things that we work with and engage with our tribal communities, and it's a mixed bag. So next slide. So this is what we promote, and it's a visual representation of what we do. On the top right, on top left side of the screen, you'll see a garden. It's kind of barren, not a whole lot. And so all we really try to do is get something that's in the community like this and move them towards to the bottom picture, which is a community garden. And this is at Yavapai Apache Nation. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. And that garden was there, and we came in with our project, and we were working with Linda Rocha from the Yavapai Apache Nation, and she had a background in gardening. So we took this garden, or we helped her with this garden, and she transformed it into this bottom picture where it's a community garden. And it wasn't just a community garden with like your normal healthy foods, but also a community garden that reintroduced like traditional foods from the Yavapai Apache Nation in this garden. And Yavapai Apache Nation is two tribes. There's the Yavapai, and then there's the Apache. So that was a conversation that we had to have with them, because cultural resilience was different for both those communities, but formally, right, with their nation, that they're combined. So it looked very different. But they incorporated both Apache and Yavapai foods within this garden as well. And that's kind of what we do. And the right picture is someone that you guys might notice if you're in Arizona. She's kind of familiar. And her name is Twyla Casador. She's done a lot of great things at San Carlos Apache tribe. We share this story with everyone because it's something that we hope to do with our grant, what she's doing. On this day, we were going around San Carlos Apache, and she was driving us around, and she was showing us the community. And when she was showing us the community, she was picking things out of the land. So we're down at the riverbed, and she was pulling things out, and she was putting it in a bag. And we did that throughout the day. And then at the end of the day, when we were concluding our meet, she asked us to build a fire. So we built a fire, and she pulled out all these bags of all the stuff that she was gathering throughout the day with us. And she started cooking us a lunch with all the stuff that she gathered throughout the day. And it was pretty amazing, because what she was doing was using her traditional San Carlos Apache tribe knowledge about the land and the foods in that area to literally make us food. And that's something that she does on a normal basis, is that she uses her traditional Apache knowledge to do current contemporary things. And that's kind of what we do. What we hope to do is support projects with that in our communities, and that's kind of what I hope that you guys all get to do in some ways with working with tribal communities and understanding all of the story and the things that happen in our communities, and to help support us to overcome those challenges, and in some ways even overcome those challenges for yourself, and understanding how colonialism and historical trauma impacts you, and how does that come out in the work that you do. Next slide, please. So these are some works cited if you're kind of nerdy like I am. Lots of different things you can read. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And this is our contact information if you'd like to reach out to myself or Madison regarding the work that we do. We're always willing to have a conversation about what we do and help others. Unfortunately, right now at ITCA, we're all in pandemic mode, so we're also working from home. So email is probably the best way to reach us. So that's our contact information. And last slide, please. And that's my last slide. So I hope I was able to help bring some conversation and questions out. So thank you.
Thank you, Eric. This is Natalie. And we do have several questions. The first one is a quick question that was asked when you put the map up of all the people that you're working with.
Okay.
And so will you be working with the SRPMIC or Salt River community?
Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community. Unfortunately, right now, we actually worked with them previously. We had previously we had 5-year grant, and we were working with them with the grant. And one of the cool things with Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community, if you're not aware, is that they have a seed bank. I wanted to say community garden, but it's not necessarily a community garden. We work with them to help develop some of that stuff that they do there. So they have a community garden, and then also when you go to the, I forget what office it is, they have these little community garden boxes outside of their building, and that's what we help them work with. But amazing group of people over there. So if you check out the Seed Saving Farm over in Salt River, it's a pretty awesome place to check out. So I highly recommend it. But yeah, we don't work with them this time around.
All right, thank you. So the next couple of questions are really important ones. Interestingly enough, they are also very similar to the questions that the group will be talking about in our breakout sessions. So I'm going to pose them to you first, Eric. It's your perspective, and
okay.
And we'll be exploring them in breakout sessions later. So when considering the need to redesign and improve care for maternal mortality, what steps would you recommend to help engage communities and foster a community that can co-design the responses needed to create sustainable change?
Oh, wow. So I think when it comes to community, what we do at ITCA and what we're aware of is first acknowledging that we're not from that community, acknowledging that that even though we may have our degrees and we might know all this stuff, is also to know that the community has its own knowledge and its own expertises and has its own processes. And for us, it's to kind of engage them in that way first, and kind of let them know like our intentions and what we want to do, and get their consent and inform them of the work. So like free, prior, and informed consent is something that we really push for in working with tribal communities. In addition to, at least, I guess, let me shift the conversation a little bit to tribal communities. With tribal communities too, is it's also to be very aware that you are an outsider, and being very aware that like if you come in as an academic or come in with like your suit and things like that all comes with baggage. It all comes with baggage. Because historically, American Indian communities, especially with researchers, we don't have a very good relationship with researchers. So even knowing that part of understanding like data and data sovereignty, all of those things are important to understand too with working with tribal communities. So when it comes to working with tribal communities, be aware of that. Be aware that we are a sovereign nation, that MOAs are important. Understanding what data sovereignty is also very helpful, and also the role in which research has been detrimental to tribal communities. And also just be aware that you're an outsider coming into a tribal community, and be aware of some of the baggages that you might be bringing in. And when I say baggages, it's also saying like your degrees, right? So a lot of folks, tribal communities, degrees really don't, I don't want to say don't matter, but in a lot of ways it will shift the conversation in a lot of ways. And normally I don't tell our tribal communities that I have a degree in American Indian Studies. I just try to meet them at their level and get to know who they are as people, and then move the conversation into the work. So I don't know if that's helpful or if that's a question that the answer that you were looking for, but
I think it's a good start. So next question, what recommendations do you have for this group so we can honor and support the traditions while working to improve healthy births?
I think part of that conversation again is understanding that what we're dealing with in tribal communities, right? It's not just a simple thing that we have issues. It's all these other issues, and it stems from how colonization has impacted this and historical trauma. Is like understanding that and being aware of that, and not dismissing it or minimizing it. And I think it's also important that we also normalize and understand like gender issues in our communities too, and understanding that we did have gender teachings with like birthing practices, women's health, and things like that. And even though we may not have access to them anymore, that bringing that into the conversation is helpful. So it's, at least for the work that I do and the work that I help and try to promote and support with others, is just being aware that all of this stuff is in our tribal communities, that colonization is there, it still happens, that there's current traumas that still happen, and to be mindful of those things. And so that, I don't know if that, I think, I don't know if that's the question or answer you were looking for.
Thank you. So the next one I'm going to give you a setup to, and then we'll get into the question. It seems like many poor outcomes in maternity health are related to systems that value the health expert over the role of the birthing woman and the woman helping women give birth. The systems values the expert's assessment of what's happening over what the woman herself is experiencing or knowing. When we add biases in terms of gender, race, culture, it seems like it can exacerbate those overarching systemic processes that can disempower and result in poor outcomes. So here's the question. How do we support systemic changes that can empower women and their supporters during the perinatal period?
Okay, so some of that might be fall out of my scope of just because I don't do a whole lot of prenatal stuff. At least for us, when it comes to when we talk with public health and chronic disease prevention, there's always that conversation of like, where does the Western experts come into the conversation, and where do our tribal experts come into the conversation? I think one thing that we do is that we always try to hear, again, I come into the communities as kind of like a third party. I'm not necessarily a part of the community, but I'm also American Indian, so I can see certain, I could see that relationship in a different way. So how we navigate that conversation is we just try to find that middle ground, and again acknowledge that the community member has experts, and say that your expertise is just as valid as this expert, Western expert, so to speak, the doctor's expertise and their knowledge. And we advocate for that initially, to say that we have to level out the playing ground, so to speak. And so that's what we do, is we have that conversation, and it's, I guess for us, it's facilitating that conversation between the two expertise, and kind of find that middle ground. And again, we have to remember too that in all communities, I think there's going to be biases on the cultural side of things, like the community side of things. Again, because of our history with Western knowledges and researchers and whatnot. So there's probably going to be some hands up and guarding the South for that, because it's just what it is. And then on the other side of the conversation, you have an expert that's usually used to having their opinion or their suggestions kind of with a certain degree of power to it. And we kind of have to have that conversation. They're like, well, you guys both have biases, right? And bringing that into the conversation and saying, you're both right. Let's try to figure out where we can meet in the middle. And sometimes that middle doesn't happen. But it's, at least for us, again, coming into the tribal communities, that we try to have that conversation. And I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of what we do. And I'm just speaking from experience.
And that's what's important, Eric. We're asking for your perspective on these questions. And thanks for your transparency on going, I think this one might be out of scope.
Yeah.
But I will do my best to share my experiences, which is what we value in your being here. And again, to the holistic audience, remember, a lot of these questions are going to be touched on in the breakout rooms, so we can expand the perspective as well. Your next question is, how can we better understand the specific tribal birthing practices and cultural breastfeeding as we now go back out into the communities? And where can we find more information, or who can send or refer patients if they're interested in learning more about traditional practices? So where's some good resources?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of two questions in that. One is like, where do you find those resources in the community? And where do you find those maybe there's other resources outside of the community. Mm-hmm. So I think part of that is that first acknowledging that the community may not have those traditional people to do that conversation. And it's kind of, you have to kind of build trust up to get to that conversation, I think, is because to ask a tribe, like if they have language and culture, sometimes that can be a bit traumatizing again, because you're kind of telling them in some ways that something happened to you guys and you guys don't have culture, so there might be something wrong with you guys. But that's like how it can be interpreted. So it's also building up trust to be able to ask that question. And some tribes won't have traditional practitioners anymore, and there might be a sense of, again, it depends on the community, a sense of shame about that, because they might think other tribes might have it, but it's also acknowledging that it's okay to not have them because of colonization, historical trauma, and being aware that when you ask those questions. So there's that part, like building the trust up to ask that question, and if they do have someone in the community that does know that, I would imagine that one person that has that knowledge is probably being asked by tens of other people, and that person's time is going to be so limited. So it's one of those things where they might have access to it, but that person may just not have the time for it. So it's finding that time and working with that community and that person that you're working with to get to that knowledge. But it may not play out how you think it's going to play out, and it's also accepting that and saying, we tried, but it just doesn't work right now, and to kind of find other ways to do it. And in terms of outside of the community, I know in New Mexico there's quite a few resources over there. I think the Indigenous breastfeeding, there's some, I forget the name of them, but they have a coalition out there that they've been doing a lot of this work. I can't remember the name of them off the top of my head, but they could be a good resource because they've been having this conversation and much broader levels about what does Indigenous breastfeeding look like, and they have conversations about birthing practices and what does that look like. I think even have conversations about like doulas and all these things that they're doing over there. So look to the New Mexico and I think even Navajo Nation for those resources, again, because I think it's also the reason why it's important to reach out to those outside resources again is because all this knowledge, these birthing practices, were in a lot of ways really disrupted. So we're, as Indigenous people, as American Indians, they're still trying to figure it out for ourselves in some ways. So it's good to have like a other place where we can have that conversation outside of our communities with other tribes and figuring out what they do, so then we can bring it back to our communities, and maybe tapping into that other resource might be helpful, if that makes sense.
And so your comments are also sparking some interactions in the chat room. So if you're not looking at the chat room, there are some Arizona resources and other resources being identified to supplement what you just mentioned, Eric.
Right.
So for that.
There's this, I'll be honest and say that recently, within the past year, 2 years, maybe even 3 years, that this conversation of Indigenous women's health related to birthing, breastfeeding, whatnot, has been becoming more prominent in our tribal communities. So a lot of these places are kind of new now, and they're in a kind of in an innovative stage now where they're starting to build the language about how we talk about the importance of breastfeeding, Indigenous breastfeeding, Indigenous birthing practices, and why it's so important. So we're in that really cool phase where we're starting to build the language about how to talk about these things. And I think it's important to kind of support those groups, because they need the support, they need the spotlight, they need the platforms to kind of talk about these things. And so definitely reach out to them. Again, I don't do a lot of that. Part of that is because I work in public health, but other part of it is because I'm a male. So I'm even learning about some of these things in different ways. So
great. We have 2 more questions.
Okay.
Next one is, can you share a link or more information about that seed saving farm that you mentioned earlier, or any information that could help us locate it on our own? Can you point the group to
I'm trying to remember his name. Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community. I'm trying to remember his name. I can't remember his name on top of it. I don't know if Lynn, Jacob Butler. There you go. Got it right there, Lynn. His name's Jacob Butler. He works at the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community. And one of the things that he does there is he does seed saving at his community garden. And the community garden is kind of tucked away. So I don't know how much or how willing he would be to have people come and visit. He's usually pretty open to it. But one of the cool things with that garden in Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community, and it's something that's I think should be highlighted, is the way in which they maintain that garden too. Is they work with behavioral health and also the jail system. So the folks that are in behavioral health are working through their issues in the jail system come to the garden and reconnect to the earth and their culture in a different way. And then it's been helping them in that way, which is amazing, because when we talk about historical trauma and all this trauma stuff, that garden has become a place of healing for the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community. And he's also bringing back seeds from their ancestors that have not existed for hundreds and maybe even tens of thousands, for a long time. So Jacob Butler, Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community. I think you can find them online. Reach out to him if you're interested in seeing what they do over there. He's given us tours, and he's actually helped us, given us different ideas of how to do community gardens and tribal communities.
All right, thank you for that. And your last question is another breastfeeding question. So how do you help communities where breastfeeding is not the norm to have the opportunities to regularly see breastfeeding if their own families are not? So I think I think the bulk of that is, how do you get exposure and familiarity, whether it's breastfeeding or other practices? In your experience, how do you bring something in when it's not the norm?
So I'll just reiterate back to what we do at ITCA when it comes to something that may not be the norm. So like eating traditional healthy foods is not the norm in most of our tribal communities. In fact, we actually think of fried bread as a traditional food when it isn't. And for us, we always have to go into the community acknowledging that healthy practices like breastfeeding are probably not present in the community because of all the colonial disruptions. And what I mean by that is, when it comes to breastfeeding, we're not taught that in our tribal communities, that it's a healthy thing, or healthy eating from our traditional foods is healthy, because we're not taught that. And part of the reason why we're not taught that is because nobody taught our parents, or nobody taught our grandparents that, or maybe our grandparents were in boarding schools and that knowledge was taken away from them. And then when they got back into their community, they weren't able to teach their kids, and then they weren't able to teach us. So I think when that conversation comes in, like these healthy practices, we have to understand where we're at in our tribal communities with all these things that we're dealing with, the impacts of colonial historical trauma, is that sometimes we don't know healthy practices because we didn't get taught them. And it wasn't necessarily our fault that we weren't taught that. It's just the situations that we were put in as a result of colonial impacts. And I think being aware of that helps you kind of see the community in a different way, as opposed to saying that they don't know how to do things. It's not that they don't know how, it's just that we weren't taught how. So that shifts the conversation to say, okay, if we don't know these things, how can I best help them get to know about these things? I think that's a different approach, because then you're at least acknowledging that colonialism, historical trauma, all those things are happening. So I don't know if that helps answer the question, but at least that's how we approach things in our work. It's a minute over, so I don't know if you guys need to stick to that time. And I think Natalie might have froze up, or maybe I froze up.
No, you're great, Eric. Natalie may have frozen, but that was the last question that we had from all of the chat. So thank you so much for navigating all of those. And like Natalie said, so many of those questions are going to lead right into our conversation that we're going to next. So we appreciate you getting us warmed up on that.
Yeah,
and,
definitely.
And all that. So do we have Natalie back? No.
Doesn't look like it.
Okay, no problem. Well, at this time, we are going to turn it over to Dave Nakashima, who is supporting us today. He does quite a lot of, I'm sure many of you have seen him before in the Maternal Health Task Force meetings or other meetings around the state. He does a lot of facilitation for us and really helped us set up what our next session is going to look like. So we hope you'll stick around for the facilitated discussions, but I'll turn it to Dave to see if you want to give a brief intro and some instructions for us.
Thank you very much, Clark, and thank you for your, excuse me, your gracefulness and graciousness as we are dealing with technology and people freezing. So once again, my name is Dave Nakashima, and I probably have met quite a few of you on this call before, doing a variety of different facilitation work for the Bureau of Women's and Children's Health. So my role today is just to transition and get you all ready for the next session, where you're going to have an opportunity to be in breakout groups. I wanted to thank Eric, as I'm still reflecting upon the many things that he had shared and said. I'm just reminded, for me, of being of Japanese ancestry, the intersection of historical trauma, and how I had an aunt, my Aunt Suma, that lived in Poston for 3.5 years, and my Aunt Mako that lived in Gila River for a little less than 3 years, because of during World War II, they were incarcerated in concentration camps that happened to be on tribal lands in Arizona. And so I can't help but reflect upon that as well as we look at the intersection of our communities and such. So based on the variety of different conversations that are happening in the chat room, or discussions or feedback or interactions that are taking place in the chat room, I think this is a perfect opportunity to move into breakout discussions regarding maternal health equity and access to care. And I just want to let folks know, and it's wonderful that we have 177 people that are still part of this virtual community, that this is an intentional time to have an opportunity to collect feedback and hear from you all through listening sessions, and to engage and involve you all as participants and stakeholders. And I'm sure after yesterday and then hearing Eric's presentation, that you're already beginning to think about suggestions on how to possibly operationalize or how to implement different things to impact the communities that we're in service to. So that's what we're going to transition into in one moment. And I just want to let you all know that I'm going to set you up for what you'll be doing. Then we'll take a break, because I know it's that time of a gathering where we need to give people a break. And then when you come back from break, you'll be automatically put into your breakout sessions, which will just work out just perfectly in theory, but I'm sure it will also in practice. So I want you to imagine that we're at, I don't know, at Black Canyon, we're at Desert Willow, and that we will be all getting up and walking to different breakout sessions in one moment, to be in smaller community, to have some interaction. And to let you know that each facilitated breakout will have a facilitator and a note taker that will guide you through an intentional group process for discussion and interaction around some questions we want to collect your feedback on. And I just want to remind you, in the spirit of what Eric presented, and in the spirit of collaboration, that, you know, when we talk about equity and we talk about access issues, I want to make sure that when we break out into smaller conversations, that we create space for conversations that model equity and access as we're in community together. And people bring different views and different perspectives for the discussion. I want to make sure we create space for all. And your facilitator will go over some ways that you can do this as a smaller community. But as my facilitation mentor had always taught me, Theta Newbreast from the Blackfoot Nation, is that we recognize we're all teachers and learners. So I want to ask you all that we have the humility that we have things to offer, but we also have things to receive and learn from one another. And that we absolutely, absolutely honor the lived experiences that people bring. And I'm going to say this with a smile because Eric has already mentioned it. We won't hold job positions and titles and credentials against you, but we want to honor the lived experience as well as the many incredible credentials, accomplishments, positions, and titles you hold. But let's also honor the PhDs that people have in lived experiences. That's what's critical. So also, just as a gentle reminder, we're not developing a scope of work. We're not developing a work plan. So there's no need to go through a prioritization process. So there's not even a need to agree on everything. We're creating a space where people can share their ideas, be creative, and give feedback that will be very helpful to guiding this work moving forward. So I just wanted to check in with the facilitators and also the team that has organized this process, if there's anything else that I need to mention. Otherwise, I will, I think, transition to give people a break, because I know they've been a very patient audience listening for quite a while. Let you stretch a little bit and then come back. So facilitation team or any of the leadership team for organizing this gathering, did I miss anything? Are we good?
Hi, Dave. Thanks very much. As I think Natalie just rejoined us, thank you for some technology issues. Just a couple of comments. Want to be sure that when people join their breakout session, they really should be unmuted so that they can contribute to the conversation, and also to share their video. That's always nice. And there should be approximately 15 to 20 people in each breakout room. So as we go to break and we regroup at, let's say 11:15, I think that'll keep us right back on target. Then if everybody can join us again at exactly 11:15, I have 10:53 on my clock. And so take advantage of the break time. Let us do our magic here and get you into your breakout sessions. And we will see you at 11:15. And then Brian, I believe, are we going to show our yoga video this morning?
Dave, this is Natalie.
Oh, hi, Natalie.
I have one other announcement. Yesterday, towards the end of the day for CEUs, a few people were unable to capture the last word. The last word is blue, B-L-U-E. So if for yesterday you missed the final word is blue.
Okay, it looks like Natalie's in a time warp there. The last word yesterday was blue. If you missed
when you leave your breakouts, when you come back here for breakouts, we'll give you some final instruction for closing out our day.
Okay, there we go. And then this afternoon, if everybody can now hear me, this afternoon as we finish, we're going to ask you all to swing back in after your breakout sessions. You will hit rejoin main meeting. We will let you know if you finish earlier, just join the main meeting again for us, and we'll give you some final information, and we will also put the link to the evaluation in the chat, but we're also going to send everybody the evaluation link by email. So if you don't get it in the chat, you'll get it by email this afternoon. Okay, so turn on your cameras, unmute yourself, and be ready to contribute at 11:15. In the meantime, we are going to show that little video of the yoga, so you can do some stretching for about 5 or 7 minutes in the meantime. So we hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you soon.